Fantastic. Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's session of the Alliance for Community Trees webcast series. The AC Trees webcast series is a monthly webcast held at the lunch hour. These trainings leverage local successes by amplifying to a larger audience two model organizations, methods, materials, research, and approaches. These sessions are planned to last no more than 1 hour, with two sets of presenters speaking on the same topic from slightly different perspectives, each for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. If you are involved with a landscape architecture board, most state landscape architecture boards require a certificate of completion for you to get credit for attending today. If you need one of those, just let me know, and Alliance for Community Trees can provide one to any of today's attendees who request one. So just shoot me an email at leland@actrees.org. This is a program of the Alliance for Community Trees. We are a national nonprofit coalition of local community tree planting nonprofits, government departments, and statewide agencies all across the country. If you're involved in planting trees and you're not a member of Alliance for Community Trees, please consider joining. A big thanks today to our partner on this webcast series, the USDA Forest Service. Today's session is Growing Safer Communities, More Trees, Less Crime. Greener neighborhoods are safer. Contrary to popular belief, trees and neighborhood greenery are linked to lower rates of crime. Confirming the findings of past research, recent studies out of Philadelphia and Baltimore have found greater drops in gun violence and crime rates in neighborhoods with more trees. This is important for your local work planting trees because it shows that your work has a significant impact on the safety of your community and that there's empirical data to support all of your urban forestry and urban greening efforts. To tell us more about it today are the folks behind these great studies and some of the greening work that is the source of those studies. We have Dr. Austin Troy, Mr. Bob Grossman, and Dr. Charlie Branis. First up today to talk about great new research out of Baltimore is Dr. Austin Troy. Dr. Troy is an associate professor at the University of Vermont's Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources with an additional appointment in computer science. He addresses issues around urban and regional planning using GIS and spatial modeling. He has a BA and a master's in forestry from Yale and a PhD from University of California, Berkeley. He's also the director of University of Vermont's Transportation Research Center and a fellow of the Gund Institute of Ecological Economics. And most important for today's discussion, he's a co-principal investigator of the Baltimore Ecosystem Study. Dr. Troy, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to bring up your presentation and invite you to take it away and tell us about what you found in Baltimore.
Great. All right, thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be on this webinar. So I'm going to talk briefly about some research I did over the last few years in Baltimore that relates to urban tree canopy and its relationship to crime. And we've been very interested in the Baltimore Ecosystem Study in conjunction with our Forest Service partners to really sort of try to better quantify some of the benefits of urban trees and understand the function, the role they play in the urban ecosystem. And crime prevention, crime reduction is one we just started looking at very recently. So what I'm going to present today is based on a paper that I just authored with, along with Morgan Grove from the Forest Service and Jarlath O'Neill Dunn from the University of Vermont that just came out in Landscape and Urban Planning. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the background theories upon which our study was built. So there's a lot of different theories out there about the relationship between crime and vegetation. And the early, some of the earlier theories posited that vegetation was a net negative when it came to crime, that it actually offered concealment and it offered opportunities that allowed criminals to, stash their loot or hide when they're plotting some sort of an attack or an assault. And I have up here on the slide you see, some of the references that talk a little bit about that. But not all vegetation is concealing. And so when people started looking at different types of vegetation, concealing versus non-concealing, there was a realization that some types of vegetation can actually do the opposite, can actually prevent crime and reduce the incidence of crime. One of the most interesting recent studies from Donovan and Prestamon, who were in the Pacific Northwest, were looking at different types of trees and how they impacted crime rates on individual private parcels, and finding that low trees that decreased the view from the first floor windows were associated with increased crime, while taller trees were associated with decreased crime. So that was a really important point, that the type of tree really mattered, and if it's not concealing, it actually has beneficial qualities. So there's a lot of proposed ways of why vegetation might actually reduce crime. The concealment one, on the one hand, that why vegetation might increase crime is pretty obvious and intuitive, but the ways in which vegetation might reduce crime are a little less intuitive. So one has to do with the idea that it actually maybe makes people less aggressive, like psychologically. Having a green environment reduces aggression, it increases cognitive function, it makes people less frustrated and angry. Another has to do with that it makes it more pleasant to be outside, so it increases the number of people out on the street, which in turn increases the quote-unquote eyes on the street, to use the terms of Jane Jacobs. And if there's more eyes on the street, there's more supervision, there's more vigilance, and it's harder for a criminal to operate. Another thing, and related to this, if there's more eyes on the street and there's more people out and about, there's going to be more social networks and more social capital. And if there's more social capital, then you have informal networks of surveillance, which is a good thing. And then finally, so it would be the inverse of the broken window theory would be the idea that having trees and other signs of positive care for the neighborhood become what's called cues to care, or a positive territorial marker, a marker that people are involved and that this is a neighborhood. It's a sign, an outward sign that this is a neighborhood with social capital. And therefore, it becomes less attractive to criminals, because criminals don't want to be acting in a place where there's obvious signs of social capital, social networks, because that means there's going to be more vigilance, and it's going to be harder to get away with a crime. So the research questions we worked on for this paper were, what is the relationship between tree canopy and crime index across an urban-rural gradient? And we're talking about quite a gradient from very, very dense urban to quite rural. Does this relationship vary for trees on public versus private land? And I'll get into that in a second. And does the relationship vary in other ways across space besides just public versus private land? Is there a systematic difference in some areas in terms of that relationship that might describe some kinds of effects that we haven't successfully captured, or what would be statisticians would call omitted effects? The study site is all of Baltimore City and Baltimore County. For those of you who aren't familiar with Maryland, basically Baltimore City is its own county, and then surrounding about 3 sides of Baltimore City is Baltimore County, which is quite large, and it includes some pretty rural landscapes in it. And the study units were 1,200 block groups. So block groups are a measure of, they're census measures. They're basically the smallest level at which you can get socioeconomic data from the census. And they usually represent a number of city blocks. So the methods that we used were we ran statistical models, and we had a very, very big data set. On the one hand, we had this incredible crime data set we'd gotten from this company called Spot Crime, and we have individual crime point locations. And so we knew where individual crimes had happened, and this is, I think, for the years 2007 to 2010. We created from that an index of non-domestic crimes. So these are crimes that happen generally outdoors, with the exception of burglary, which involves coming from the outside into the inside. So it was an index of robbery, burglary, theft, and shooting. We excluded assault because assault includes so many domestic assaults, and so many of those happen indoors and are independent, potentially independent from the environment, or in a way that we weren't really trying to explain. The main effects variables we were looking at were from this incredible data set we had built of very high resolution land cover for these two counties that included tree canopy. So we had essentially a bunch of different explanatory variables here. The total percentage of the tree canopy within a block group, the percentage of tree canopy on private lands, the percentage of tree canopy on public lands, which is going to be things like not just parks, but also street rights-of-way. And then what we did is we eliminated the rights-of-way, and we only looked at the public percent of trees on public lands for like the non-rights-of-way, the parks and things like that. And then we controlled for a whole bunch of confounders, things that actually could be very correlated that, if you only looked at the relationship between crime and trees, you could get some very spurious results because the actual effect might be due to things like income or home type or other kinds of things that are actually correlated with tree cover, but aren't the true cause. So, or that don't relate to the relationship that we're looking at. So we controlled for income, housing age, race, home type, owner occupancy, population density, ruralness, the amount of agriculture, and the amount of protected land. We used a bunch of statistical models, linear regression, where for those of you who are statistical, aficionados, we used a box-Cox transformation. We did a spatial lag regression, which, for those of you who are interested, is basically controlling for the fact that in this kind of environment, things nearby tend to be very similar. It's called autocorrelation, and when you get that, you can have some serious statistical problems if you don't control for it. And then we did this thing called geographically weighted regression, which allowed us to look for variation in relationships over space. This is just to give you an idea of the types of, what the outputs look like. Everything with the stars next to it, the asterisk next to it, is significant, statistically significant, and you'll see below an R-squared. This is for our spatial models, and we see what's called a pseudo R-squared of 0.9. It sort of, kind of, roughly means we're explaining about 90% of the variance in crime here, which is very good. What we see is that when we see P-tree pub, etc., basically that's just saying, and we see a negative number on those, what it's showing is that basically crime and trees are inversely related. The higher your tree level, the lower your crime level, even after you control for all those other things down at the bottom of the list. And what the difference between Model 4, 5, and 6 here is that Model 4 is looking at all trees. So how does trees on all land affect crime? The next one is how do trees on public land affect crime and private land affect crime? And then the last model is when we look at a different measure of public land where it does not include the rights of way, only the parks and things like that. And in all cases, what we see is it's negative. But I summarized this in a slightly easier way on the next page here. What we see is, so basically we have good fit. We accounted for a lot of the variance. We controlled for lots of confounders that might otherwise be correlated with tree cover and lead to spurious conclusions. And basically, so the spatial model that I presented there tends to be much more conservative than our other models. So the numbers are smaller, but even still, with these smaller numbers, we're still getting these incredible results, showing that a 10% increase in tree cover results in 11.8% decrease in crime. That effect is 37% greater for public than for private land trees. So public trees seem to have a bigger impact than private land trees. And when the rights of way are not included in the public tree calculation, the effect of public land trees is 30% greater than when they are included. So again, it's showing that it seems like the public park-type trees are really important. And when rights of way are not included, the difference between public and private jumps from 37%, as I just presented, to 70%. So clearly those non-right-of-way public trees are really potent, really important in fighting crime. But this is showing that all trees matter, all of them, public and private, the most important being the public ones off of rights-of-way. So the relationship between crime and total tree canopies varied also across space, and so did the relationship between private trees and crime. But the relationship between crime and public trees did not. So I'll show a map to kind of give you an idea of what I mean. So this is the map showing the difference in the relationship. The color basically refers to what the relationship is between crime and trees, holding everything else constant. And so it's showing in most places, you get the green shade, which is showing that the more trees you have, the lower the crime rate. But in a few of those other areas, like here in Wagner's Point, Hawkins Point, Brooklyn Park, Dundalk, you get the opposite relationship where more trees actually equals higher crime. So there are a few geographic areas where the opposite, that are outliers, where the opposite is true. And we tried to understand why that might be. And one of the theories we came up with is just the fact that these areas that had the opposite sign, where more trees means more crime, tend to have a lot of lower, scrubbier, undergrowth type trees. And particularly what they have a lot of, and this is from Google Street View, what they have a lot of is interface zones between industry and residential areas. And in a lot of those interface zones, there's unmanaged, low, scrubby trees that do really afford very good concealment. And that might be one of the reasons why we see that difference in these areas. Here's another example. I believe this is from Dundalk. So that might be one explanation for why that is. So in conclusion, let's add one more very nice benefit to the list of existing urban tree benefits, and this is a great one. This is what we found is very much is consistent with what some of these other recent studies have been finding about the fact that trees really can be positive in terms of reducing crime. What it also tells us is that we should be using trees and active landscape design as environmental crime avoidance strategy. It doesn't just mean planting trees or just letting trees grow. It means having the right kind of trees. It means having as many canopy trees as possible. It means, and as we saw, unmanaged trees can actually be a liability. So doing something to manage those unmanaged stands of vegetation that afford concealment. Combine this with social capital building for neighborhoods. Get police departments involved with urban forestry issues because this is really should be part of their crime avoidance strategy. And really go after the vegetation that affords concealment. Police departments should be working with, urban tree stewardship organizations to really try to find those areas where you have that highly concealing vegetation that doesn't necessarily need to be there, that's not maybe adding aesthetically to an area, and to do something about that, and particularly on abandoned lots. And I know Baltimore has some great programs in this respect, like the Power and Dirt program. There's a bunch of urban vacant lot greening programs that are trying to do exactly this sort of thing. So basically, it's really showing that I think even after you control for all these other factors, trees really do seem to be an important element in this crime equation. And I'll stop right there. Thank you very much. And here's some my thanks.
Fantastic. That is awesome and really awesome research coming out of Baltimore that you and Morgan and Jarlath all worked on, public partners in Baltimore. This is great stuff. I think what I really appreciate and many of our listeners will appreciate are these recommendations at the end that you just showed us about how they can translate this to their communities. What I want to do now is open up the lines for questions and answers to everyone on the call, and you can ask your question by typing it in that question and answer tab at the top of your screen. You see it says Q&A, and you can type in your questions there, and we will go through and answer them. While you're doing that, I'll give everyone a minute to formulate their questions and start typing them in. But I guess, Austin, I would want to start out. My question for you is I see that there are a lot of local nonprofit professionals who are on this call, local urban greening and urban forestry nonprofits. And I guess, there's this great data that's come out of Baltimore from your research, how, and I love your suggestions for, working with the local police, how would you suggest they present this to their city saying, well, this is Baltimore, but, we think it's going to apply here as well?
So I think there needs to be more research on this. It's an emergent area of research, but the fact that the Donovan and Prestamon study in, I believe it was Oregon, came up with something that was very consistent with our Baltimore study shows that this, there might be some generalizability to this. A lot of the other research that I cited has been done in, other cities like Chicago and a number of other places. So I do think it's generalizable, and but we need more research to really make that case strong. And luckily, as we're getting more and more data on things like, crime data is getting easier and easier to get a hold of. Land cover data and tree canopy data is getting easier to get a hold of. As these data sets become more available, we can start looking at this question over a larger area and start making more generalizations that will hopefully influence policymakers.
Fantastic. Thank you. A question over the web that's actually, I think, really relevant because this is some of the pushback that a lot of people hear, and maybe you could go back to this page. Can you remind us of non-tree canopy factors that you ruled out of the equation that can influence crime rates?
Sure. So the things I controlled for include, here they are. So income, housing age, which is really important because, the center of Baltimore, those row houses are much older than the suburban housing in general. Race, home type, so, single family, detached home versus townhome versus multifamily. Owner occupancy, so renter versus owner occupied areas. Population density, rural versus urban, agriculture, areas with agriculture, because they have fewer trees but for a different reason. Protected lands, they have more trees, but for a different reason. And so all these things now, they all seem similar, but when you look at them on a correlation matrix, they're all distinct. They have some correlation, but they're all distinct dimensions. And between those, we spent a lot of time really figuring out what to use as control factors, and this list was fairly robust. And we tried other things too. And even when you added lots of other variables, the main effect still stayed significant, and that's important to know. It's a very robust result.
That's so good to hear. These are, again, people always bring these up as saying, oh, well, it's just a wealthier neighborhood or a poorer neighborhood.
Yeah, and let me actually, that's a good point. A good way to explain this, when I say that I'm controlling for these things, what it means is that if there's two neighborhoods with the exact same, say they're both sort of lower income, denser, older housing, otherwise, exactly the same in all those socio-demographic ways, but one has more trees and one has fewer trees. The one with more trees will have lower crime, all else being equal.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. Another good question over the line. What about conifers or evergreen trees? Are they considered concealing? Some people like them for their stormwater benefits, and they're wondering how that fits into what you found.
I love evergreens. I have a whole bunch in my yard, and I do know that a lot of urban foresters are extremely wary about conifers for a number of reasons, having to do with sap, pine resin, tar, those kinds of things. But also the concealment factor. When they're young, they tend to be, bushier and more concealing. But when they get older, and it depends on the species, some of the, spruces and things like that might really have a lot of low concealing vegetation unless you actively manage and prune them. Some of the other pines might be a little less so. The truth is, as these trees get older, particularly the pines, they're going to offer very little concealment. It's when they're young that it's a problem. But I do know that a lot of urban forestry organizations just don't want to deal with them because they're too much trouble, or they perceive them as being too much trouble. I think we should give conifers a chance.
Give conifers a chance.
Yeah.
All right, we have a couple more questions lined up, but I just wanted to check in with Mr. Bob Grossman. Bob, are
Yes.
you on the line?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Oh, we hear you great. Okay. Another few questions before we move on. People are so excited about this topic. I do want to let everyone know that we will be sending out, after this session, in about 1 week's time, we'll send out the link to this recording and a resource list that has information about both the research done in Baltimore and in Philadelphia. We'll have links to their original studies so that you will have this to review and to use in the future. Question for you over the lines about other communities that have done similar studies and anything on the West Coast. I know you mentioned Jeff Donovan's research out in Portland and Dr. Close's research in Chicago. Maybe you could just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's really just not that much research on this, and you know, it's besides, I mean, I basically sort of mentioned kind of the highlights, at least from the literature review of my paper. So I'm not like a super big expert on the past literature, but these are the ones that I'm most aware of, mainly, you know, Chicago, Oregon. There's been a little bit in Oakland, and then Philadelphia, of course, and Baltimore. So.
Okay, great. A couple other really good questions. It's I guess your study used census block groups as a geographic unit. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were able to control for the other variables. How would you study cities that have some community groups engaged in tree planting and maintenance in various parts of the city, but these areas don't form coherent geographic units? I know that might be a complicated scientific question, but maybe you just had a thought off the top of your head.
So, yeah, if you were going to control for, like, tree stewardship activity or intensity, you know, you could definitely, you know, try to estimate, you know, block groups they're kind of roughly sort of approximate neighborhoods sometimes, not always, but you can definitely, you know, you could say, you know, this is a block group where, you know, it has some tree activity, stewardship activity going on, and you can control for that as a factor in your regression and see if that has any impact. You know, we do have, I worked with the Forest Service. They created a wonderful thing, a stewardship map, actually, for New York City, where they mapped hundreds, maybe even thousands of groups, the sphere of influence of these groups in New York City that work on environmental stewardship. So you can actually map these things now, which is a very interesting thing to do. So you could come up with sort of an intensity number for every neighborhood or every block group about, you know, how much stewardship's going on.
Awesome. Thank you. And one final question before we move on, and anyone who has asked additional questions, we will have more time later on in the session to get back to those. But a good question about a common problem in today's economic climate is the reduction of municipal budgets and staff, which results in lower levels of service for overall landscape maintenance. And thinking of unmanaged trees as a potential factor for increased crime levels, that would seem to be a reason to reduce tree planting, if you see that logic.
Yep.
So what kind of funding strategy might you suggest to offset this approach?
That's a really good question. I haven't ever really thought about that. I mean, it would be very interesting to do some sort of accounting analysis where you could, you know, with further research, you could probably start coming up with, you know, a return on investment analysis. You could actually start quantifying the amount of law enforcement money saved by planting these trees, and it's definitely going to be a positive return on investment. And if you can prove that somehow, then you can start hopefully leveraging money for urban tree stewardship. Right now, a lot of it's through the nonprofit sector, through private fundraising and grants and things like that. I think it would be wonderful if cities could, you know, see that this is an investment that actually pays dividends.
Awesome idea. One final question. Did you consider using LIDAR to correlate the incidence of crime with the height of the canopy?
Oh, excellent question. That is what we really would like to do next. We do have LIDAR data for, I believe, both those counties, and so it's Technically, it's fairly complicated and computer intensive to get all those heights and assign them to individual tree polygons and things like that. But that's definitely something we can do and we want to do, and that will allow us to start getting at this concealment issue, which I think is an important issue.
Fantastic. That is awesome. Really exciting stuff on that's been done, and a lot more that could be done. I think our takeaway from this first session not only is the amazing results confirming what we know about trees creating safer communities, but we need more research. So everyone out there who can work on that, let's get more research. Work on that in your cities with your universities. There are professors there who are interested in this kind of work. Talk to them about them. Show them what great stuff has been done in Baltimore and in Philadelphia, and start down the road on more research. We'll do another webcast on it. Thank you so much, Austin. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We are going to move from just East Coast a little bit, from Baltimore to Philadelphia, with our next presenter out of the great state of Pennsylvania. We will have two folks co-presenting for the second half of our webcast, Mr. Bob Grossman and Dr. Charlie Brannis. Bob Grossman is the director of Philadelphia Green, a program of the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And through Philadelphia Green, Bob manages the nationally recognized Philadelphia Land Care Program, which is a recipient of the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center's Bright Ideas Award for Innovation in Government in 2011. Bob's staff directs vacant land stabilization, quantifies economic and environmental benefits of greening, and performs park revitalization, community garden plantings, and urban tree canopy restoration. While he's based out of Philadelphia, he's talking to us from New Orleans today, so we are getting a cross-country presentation. But I believe back home in Philly, we also have Dr. Charlie Brannis, who is an associate professor of epidemiology and director of the Cartographic Modeling Laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also held numerous other university appointments, including as a Penn Fellow in the University Office of the Provost. Dr. Brannis' work incorporates human geography and spatial interactions. His studies have taken him to various places, including neighborhoods of Philadelphia, rural counties across the U.S., and cities and small towns in Guatemala and other countries. Dr. Brannis has been on various boards and scientific review panels at the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, the Canadian National Research Council, and the South African Medical Research Council. He's a past president of the Society of Advancement of Violence and Injury Research, and we are very excited to have both Charlie and Bob here today. We're going to start off with Bob telling us about the Philadelphia Land Care Program. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you, Leland. It's a pleasure to join all of you today. The Philadelphia Land Care Program is a 12-year-old project of the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, or PHS, to address the blight caused by 40,000 vacant lots in Philadelphia. For us, this project was born of personal experience. Since 1974, the Philadelphia Green Program, the urban greening program of PHS, has been making use of the city's vacant land, helping to create community gardens as sources of healthy food for the gardeners, their families, and friends. But while we were working in the older neighborhoods of Philadelphia, we witnessed the stress that was caused by the proliferation of drugs and violence. We could see blighted lots used as public dumps, stashes for weapons and drugs. We saw children walk down the middle of the street because it was too dangerous to walk near the vacant lots that lurked on their way to school. We realized that we could not turn all these lots into community gardens, but we thought we could do something else. Clean them up, plant trees, keep the grass mowed. Reveal the land that had been hidden by blight. Bring trees and green space back into the urban fabric. So we took our simple idea and studied the cost of vacancy and the effectiveness of existing city programs. We arrived at two conclusions. First, while the city government does not own all of the vacant land, it owns the problems associated with vacancy. And secondly, the existing city programs based on sporadic lot cleanups were ineffective in dealing with the long-term issues and cost of abandoned land. Many of the costs of vacancy reside in other parts of the city budget: the decline of the city's tax base, the costs associated with crime and violence, and the public health costs that accompany unsanitary conditions caused by dumped debris, pollutants, and rodents. Beginning in 2000, PHS received a contract from the Philadelphia Empowerment Zone to create a system of vacant land management in one neighborhood of Philadelphia. Due to the success of this pilot project, the city began a series of annual contracts with PHS to manage a vacant land program citywide. Now called the Philadelphia Land Care Program, PHS manages and maintains about 6,000 parcels across the city and continues to create new sites each fall and spring season. The program design is more complex than landscape design. Sorry, I went too fast here.
Thanks for, oh, there you go. I think that's the right slide.
I moved on too fast.
No problem. Would you mind speaking up just a little bit?
Okay. The program design is more complex than the landscape design, involving the partnership of multiple city agencies, many community-based organizations, landscape contractors, and PHS. So the two previous slides showed you the before and afters of the program. The first slide is a typical vacant lot in Philadelphia before treatment, and the after slide demonstrates the treatment. We cleaned a lot of debris, bricks, and concrete, amended topsoil, plant trees along the perimeter, sow grass, bring it with a simple post and rail wood fence, which discourages dumping and provides an identity, a brand, for all the land in this program. Once in the program, these lots are cleaned and mowed twice a month, April through October. PHS and the city share the view that this simple treatment is more than a cleanup project. It is transformational in its impact on community health and stability and provides the foundation for future community development. Trees are an important element of this transformational impact. Visually, trees give the landscape a type of authenticity and structure. We often work in neighborhoods that are barren of trees in the streetscape. The nearly 5,000 trees that populate these park-like landscapes are often the only trees on the block. The treatment is an attractive placeholder until a permanent use of the land is determined. Sites are selected strategically to have the greatest visual impact on the appearance of the neighborhood. The idea is to encourage investment because the neighborhoods look cleaner and safer. When we started this program, we designed it to improve the quality of life for neighborhood residents who were beset by the multiple problems associated with blight. We've observed the impact of this program every day from its inception. We know that it displays open-air drug markets. We know that it has eliminated an easy way to hide drugs and guns. We found those guns and drugs during our lot cleanups, but we did not have the data to back up our observations. Enter Dr. Charles Brannis. Over the past few years, we've been fortunate to be associated with Dr. Brannis and his research team, who have been studying the impact of the land care program on criminal activity and measures of health. Dr. Brannis, can you tell us what your research has found?
Thanks, Bob. Can you confirm, Leland, that you can hear me?
Yep, we hear you great, and your slides are up.
Outstanding, so I don't just launch into talking and know that you don't hear me. Okay, so thanks so much, Bob. We really appreciate it, and thanks also to the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society for the opportunity to learn about and study their greening program. I'm an epidemiology faculty member and director of the cartographic modeling lab here at the University of Pennsylvania. The University of Pennsylvania has been working to improve our city's vacant spaces problem for almost a decade now. Although much of our attention has focused on the negative economic impacts of vacant space, more recently, and I think very importantly, we've begun to consider the health and safety impacts of these blighted and abandoned spaces. So the recent direction of Penn is part of a larger effort to explore structural and place-based interventions as solutions to some of the nation's most pressing health problems. The quote here brings to light an important advantage of place-based programs, that they can potentially touch more people for longer periods of time than other programs that focus only on individuals or lifestyle modification. These individual lifestyle modification programs have really been a staple for public health for the past 50 years. And in some ways, the place-based focus is an old-school public health approach that's being rebirthed right now, and that traces its time back in the U.S. to a time when public health officials and city planners worked closely together to engineer safe and healthy places. Now, it was with that in mind that several years ago we undertook some preliminary studies showing that vacant properties were of great concern, both numerically and in terms of the many people in Philadelphia who were exposed to these eyesores every day on their way to work or school, or worse yet, right outside their homes. And we wanted to do more than just to describe this problem. We wanted to see now what would happen if someone actually intervened and changed things. So together with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society and the City of Philadelphia, we had a team of epidemiologists, criminologists, anthropologists, economists, and members of the community who were pleased to have the opportunity to evaluate the health and safety impact of the PHS program. So we did this for a full decade, as you can see from this slide, and we did it as part of what's called a quasi-experimental study, in which we took almost 4,500 lots that had received the greening treatment that Bob just described to you. Each of these were matched to 3 randomly selected control lots, which are in gray here. So these are hotspot maps of the green lots and the control lots in gray. And these randomly selected control lots did not receive the greening treatment, but very importantly could have over the same 10-year time period. The almost 4,500 lots that were greened by PHS here totaled almost 8 million square feet of space in Philadelphia, and were comparably distributed across the 4 sections of the city that we studied. And I'll also add that the control lots and the green lots, differences between them were managed statistically, in much the way you had seen prior shown with Dr. Austin's presentation, but also through a matching protocol in terms of within sections of the city of Philadelphia. So that really, in the end, over time, the same lots were compared within the same sections. So what did we find? The health and safety effects were really striking. Most noticeably, we found statistically significant reductions in gun assaults across the city, and these were tied to the greening. The green lots, we think what was going on is that the green lots may have signaled that someone in the community cared and was watching over the space in question, but maybe more clearly, the newly green lots also may have no longer served as havens or storage grounds or disposal points for illegal guns. And this was an explanation that Bob relayed to you and that we've also been told time and again in working with people in the neighborhoods themselves. I'll also add that for select sections of Philadelphia, we also found significant reductions in vandalism, as well as high stress, and that exercise was increased. And again, all this was tied to the greening. Going forward, we're confident in recommending the PHS vacant lot greening program as a very promising health and safety intervention for Philadelphia and, in fact, other cities. We think that the study design that we employed has a decent amount of generalizability. In all, the greening of heavily blighted vacant urban lots was inexpensive, easily scalable, and tied to significant improvements in important crimes and health indicators. This is especially valuable given that the U.S. still has tens of millions of vacant and abandoned properties. And I will say that again with our colleagues at the PHS and the City of Philadelphia, we're now moving forward to do an actual experiment, an actual community-based trial where we're going to be randomly assigning the greening treatment of vacant lots to hundreds of lots, and also randomly assigning hundreds of lots to receive only trash pickup and hundreds of lots to be held to not receive the treatment at all, and we're going to compare them. And again, through the random assignment, that will be a perfect way to equilibrate all the three different groups. So I'm going to just leave you with this before-after photo, which I think captures the intense visual shift in the vacant spaces that we've been discussing before and after they've been greened. For any of you who want full details of our study, I'm happy to provide copies of the original article in the American Journal of Epidemiology that put this, or email it to Leland or Sarah, and they can post it to you online. Happy to take any questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brandis, and thank you, Bob. This is a very nice and similar, but at the same time complementary project that shows a different angle on how trees and greening make your neighborhood a safer, healthier place to live. And I'll open the line for questions, but I've got so many for you. I was about to start it right in. But again, I want to remind folks that you can now type in your questions to us over the Q&A tab on your screen. Just type Q&A, or click on the Q&A tab, type in your questions, and we will ask them out loud for you and get answers from the experts. While you're doing that, I guess some of my first thoughts are, I really like the way that you are approaching this from a health and sort of safety, well-being standpoint rather than just a crime, but you're looking at this as an epidemiologist, and you're thinking about what this means for the well-being of the citizens and residents in these areas. I'm wondering if you can talk about how that background or that mindset shaped the way you approached this project.
Well, we consider crime, particularly violent crime, to be a health issue. So we put health and safety together in that regard. And that I've been studying violence for quite some time, and approaches to reduce violence as a health issue, as a public health issue. But I think partly, in answer to your question, I think partly what's driving this is what's driving our choice of outcomes. So that whole public health mindset is driving our choice of the things that we want to study, ranging from crime, again, which we think is a health issue, to issues of mental health, exercise, and general well-being that people have.
Thank you. And I know you specifically looked at gun violence, and the idea that these are not just spaces that are abandoned so no one's paying attention, so that violence takes place there, but they're also, as abandoned lots, sort of vehicles for violence by just serving as a container, essentially, for weapons. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your findings with gun violence in particular and greening.
Well, I mean, the mechanism, there's a physical mechanism that we're positing, which Bob mentioned and I did as well, that these lots are opportunities to hide illegal guns. And the way that works is if you're part of an illegal market, say you're moving drugs, being caught with your weapon, it holds a lot of repercussions for you. And it could up the ante in terms of the prosecution that you get. So you can't carry the gun with you. You need to hide it, but at the same time, you're in an illegal market, and if there's a dispute in that illegal market, you can't just call the police and ask them to settle the dispute. So there's this problem for folks who are in these illegal markets, and the guns are part of it, and of course the guns lead to the injury in the end. And so greening the lots, as you can see from the picture, there's very many fewer places to hide a gun in the picture on the right. I'll just add one more thing, too. Gun crimes, we did find impact for gun crimes. But to be fair, we studied a dozen different crimes. And it just so happened that gun crimes rose to the top. And it's partly what we're positing here. So many of the other crimes we did not find an effect. So we are thinking a lot about the gun crimes and the impact that these greening the lots have on them, and that's a significant impact, especially for a city like Philadelphia, in which gun crime really drives a lot of people's activities in day-to-day life. And it's a major problem.
It's a fascinating finding. This is a question for Bob, I think. It's about the maintenance of these spaces once you've greened them. Sort of how do you who's responsible for the upkeep going forward through the land care program, and how do you support those efforts? Is it local residents or?
Well, we have a contract with the city of Philadelphia. We manage the entire program from the initial landscape installations through the maintenance, ongoing maintenance. And so our inventory of maintained land keeps growing. Part of the reason for doing this and part of the interest that the city has is that they also want to have these sites turn over in terms of new investment in the neighborhood. So we've had about 15% of our sites, which are in low market communities, also become new houses and new places of businesses. But in general, we manage the maintenance of these sites, and we do that through a system of landscape contractors and community organizations that are acting as contractors. They bid on maintenance packages, and it's done annually, and this is all funded through our city contracts.
Excellent, thanks. And I guess just another question about this greening program and the impact on the residents in these neighborhoods. Since this is private property, is the public allowed to use the space, or are the fences also meant to keep the public out?
No, the fences are not meant to keep the public out. It's basically to discourage dumping and to define the perimeter. There's a theory of community design that says a defensible boundary is an important part of discouraging criminal activity. We didn't know that when we started this program. We just did it because it thought it made sense to us to do it. And now the fence has become an important component of the program. I get calls from people all the time who say, can you give me the fence? And again, most of the sites that we work on are a combination of privately owned and publicly owned land. So we don't have any authority to keep people out of the site, but it's rather to define the perimeter, discourage dumping, and to act as a brand for the program.
I guess this is a question for Dr. Brandis and for Bob. I'm not sure what the scope of your study, but in looking at crime reduction or just crime effects realized by the greening of abandoned lots, did they reduce crime? Is your sense that it reduced crime overall, or do you think it moved from these greened locations to non-greened locations?
I'm happy to answer that. And I think for the findings I was talking about, if I said it was for one section of the city, then I meant that the finding was strictly limited to one of the 4 sections of the city. However, for gun assaults, for instance, the findings were citywide. So we found them for all 4 sections. And the way we designed this is we studied this at various levels of geography. So much like the block groups that Troy was talking about before, we studied it in the block group level, in a census tract level, as well as a broader level within a radius around each of the blocks, and varying the sizes of those. And based on that, we chose findings that were consistent between all these different geographic sizes. So, in fact, the bottom line is we don't think that crime just moves around the corner once a greening happens. We think it's a net reduction for the space in question.
Fantastic.
And the community also has more investment in these sites. Even though we're managing a large-scale program that involves landscape contractors and not community cleanups, once these sites get cleaned up, the community has a certain amount of investment in them. And, I also get calls if the contractor didn't cut the grass right or didn't do the edging right. So it's a big transformation in the city's attitude about how the neighborhood visually looks, and people have an investment in that, even though it may not be their own. They're not out there cutting the grass themselves.
Right. And what's out of curiosity, what's the expectancy for the length of time that these improved treated spaces will last before they're reused or built upon?
It really depends on what part of the city that we're working in. Some of these communities probably won't see new investment for many years. Others of them are kind of on the edges of healthy real estate markets, and they're the ones most likely to be developed sooner.
And this is a question that relates, I think, to Dr. Brandt's one of your final points about the research that you guys are going to do, PHS and University of Pennsylvania together, moving forward to look at this in an even more concerted effort. But I guess sort of how have you selected where to green, what neighborhoods to green, and have you done that related to looking at crime or other information about different neighborhoods?
No, quite the opposite.
Okay.
So our intent in that experiment going forward is to randomly choose the lots, so that if we really, and that's the best way to isolate the effect of the greening and to tell whether it's really affecting these crimes. So if we chose the lots to green based on where the crime is, we would only be able to make a very limited statement. So we are doing this citywide. I will tell you that that's going to reduce our opportunities in certain neighborhoods just because, for instance, in northeast Philadelphia, there are very few vacant lots to begin with, but that's only one small portion of the city. I would say the rest of the city will be involved in that and things will be random, as in any true experiment.
Great. I think we have time for one more question here, and it's just going to be about the community response to the greening. I know you've already spoken about that a little bit, but it sort of ties together with questions about safety. Were there any safety issues that you experienced either in planning the greening of a lot or while actually doing the greening from folks in the neighborhood, perhaps criminals who didn't want you to be taking away their stash spots?
That from time to time is an issue, and if it's a serious issue, we move on and do something else.
Gotcha.
But typically, there's enough support in the community for this that we've been doing it for a long time, and when we show up, the drug dealers realize they've just lost a lot, and they move on. That, may get to the point of does the crime move to another location, but what we're doing is reducing the opportunities for crime, and I think that has a cumulative effect over time.
Great, and actually sort of a good follow-up and a question that will tie both your presentation together with Dr. Troy's is what advice do you have for local nonprofits like PHS in other cities or other actors who want to green up lots and want to do this in partnership with law enforcement agencies? What advice do you have for sort of selling something like this to them or working with law enforcement?
Well, we actually work closely in some neighborhoods more than others. With depends on how active the captain is in those areas. But we work closely with police whenever we can because they're a big supporter of this program. I would say for anyone who's just trying to start up a program similar to this, we started small, and typically that's the way you have to start because resources are limited, but you have to demonstrate the efficacy of what you're doing. And if you start at a scale that you can manage and you can demonstrate that it has impact, then you can find other resources.
So can I add to that, Leland? Just to say that I think that there was, from our standpoint from the University of Pennsylvania, I've been working with the police department for over a decade, and I think there were some questions about this initially, but they are so enthusiastic about this because this program and greening in general are programs that they consider, quote, soft policing. And it's a real opportunity for them if they don't have to expend resources in a green neighborhood, those are police resources that they can redirect somewhere else. So they are, as Bob was just saying, they are very much in line with this and very much appreciative of this program and other programs like it. And I'll just, Austin's prior comment about reaching out to your police agencies, I think, is very important. And making those, it's a seemingly unrelated connection, but a very important one.
And thank you, Dr. Brannis, Bob, and Dr. Troy for helping everyone figure out how to make this case for safer communities through trees and urban greening. Really appreciate your taking the time to talk to all of us today. These presentations and the recorded session and a resource list will be available in about 1 week on the Alliance for Community Trees website, and we will send that all out to everyone who completes this survey that you can see on your screen right now. We would really appreciate your feedback both on this session and on the AC Trees webcast series so that we can make sure we're providing information and topics that matter to you. We'll also send this link out by email in just a second. So again, thanks for taking 2 seconds to fill it out. A big, big thank you to Dr. Austin Troy, Mr. Bob Grossman, and Dr. Charlie Brannis for presenting today on these case studies in Baltimore and Philadelphia. And a thank you to the USDA Forest Service for putting on this webcast with us. And a big thanks to everyone who attended for the last hour. We really appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you for our next webcast. Have a great afternoon, everyone. It's hot all over the country, so stay cool, hide in the shade of a tree, and make sure to water your trees. Thanks, everybody.